So I think we can all agree that if you want to make amazing video, you're going to want a camera that delivers on image quality. Well, today I have the Sony FX3. This cinema line camera from Sony delivers on just that. Let's go ahead and talk about why this camera might be the perfect video camera for you and your YouTube channel. And make sure you stay tuned to the end, as I'm gonna give you my comparison to why I think this camera might be better than the Sony a7S III. First off, image quality. This camera has a 12 megapixel sensor. It delivers beautiful, crisp 4K video. This camera shoots 4K video in 24, 30, 60, and even 120 frames per second. You can even shoot RAW over HDMI with this camera. And I can tell you that the image quality is nothing less than beautiful on this camera. At some point, we're going to switch over to this camera. I'm going to show you exactly what the image quality looks like coming out of this camera. Now, one of the things that I've absolutely come to love about this camera is that it has a ton of customizable buttons. Most of them are already set to give you exactly what you need without having to go into any of the menu systems. So for example, this thing has a button for iris. That is your aperture. So in a normal Sony hybrid camera, you're going to be looking for aperture. This is going to change the aperture of your lens. It also has a programmed white balance button, which you can really quickly change your white balance. It also has an ISO button. With the iris and the ISO button, you can remap those buttons. Why? Because there are 3 dials on this thing. It has a front dial, a back dial, and then it also has the control pad, which you can map your ISO. So do you really need the iris and the ISO? Probably not. You could probably remap those. For the 2 weeks that I had this, I didn't remap them. I just left them the way they were. It also has a giant record button, and you can also turn the shutter into a record button as well. I absolutely love to do on all my Sony cameras that allow that feature. Now the joystick is on the top of this camera, which you would use with your thumb. It is pressable, so this way you can snap that focus back to center or lock on. On the back of the camera, programmable button number 5. It is a focus magnifier, which is really nice because then you can zoom in on your focus and you can see exactly what is in focus and what is not. On the back here, the right button is set up for peaking, so it immediately turns on your peaking so you can see the areas that are in focus or out of focus once you're in manual mode. It also has the left button, which turns on zebras and turns off zebras. So you can quickly turn those on and off without having to go into the menu system and really have to play around. Now, normally on my Sony a7 IV, for example, which we're shooting on right now, I normally have my zebras in the function menu, which allows me to go in between shots. But if I want to turn it off while I'm shooting, I can't do that unless I set a programmable button. The Sony FX3 automatically has a button set for zebras, so you can turn it on and turn it off real quickly. It also has a shutter button, which you can remap as well, because at the end of the day, you got those 3 customizable dials, so you don't necessarily need to have a dedicated shutter button. Now, I did program custom button number 4 to be my LUTs on, LUTs off. Now, since this camera has been updated to firmware version 2.0, it does have this special menu system, which allows you to change most of your primary settings right here in this home menu. I think that has been a fantastic upgrade that Sony should maybe think about putting in all their cameras. It makes it super quick to be able to change from 24 to 120 frames per second. You can change your ISO, your Kelvin value. Everything is right here for you to be able to change. And I think that was a really smart move, because what I found myself is not really having to dive so much into the menu system. And really, I was just able to go into that menu and change the settings that I needed to change. So between the main menu and all these customizable buttons, the function menu seemed to be something that I didn't really have to use. And I didn't have to dive into other features, because if I had a feature that I wanted to use, I could just put that in the My menu and it was right there. So like, for example, monitor brightness. Sometimes when you're outside, you need to crank up that monitor brightness, turn it to sunny weather. I'll go ahead and I'll turn that on through the My menu system. So this way I don't have to really dive into the whole menus. You set it up once and you're good to go. Now this thing has tally lights for days. You got a tally light on top, the record button turns on. There's a tally light on the back so you can see your recording. You can turn on the LCD screen, which is flippable, of course, and that is going to give you a tally light around the box here. This camera lets you know you're recording, so you're always knowing when you're ready to shoot. Now, I did mention that this thing was updated to firmware 2.0, and with it came Cine EI, which is also available in the Sony FX6, and the FX9. So if you're used to that workflow, now with the Sony FX3, you're gonna be able to get that Cine EI profile right here in camera. So Cine EI is basically Sony's S-Log3, but it only lets you shoot in the base ISOs. So you're only gonna be able to shoot in 800 or 12,800. When you're shooting in regular S-Log3, the base ISOs are 640 and 12,800. Why did Sony up it to 800? I don't know. Just know that when you're using Cine EI, it will up to 800. Now the downside with Cine EI, it does not do any auto white balance. You're always going to want a grade card to white balance this camera. And in fact, if you need a grade card, there'll be a link down in the description below. Feel free to pick this thing up. This was only like $7. This thing makes sure that all of your videos are shot at the proper white balance. Now with Cine EI, like I said, it does lock the camera into either one of two base ISOs, either 800 or 12,800. And then what you do is you adjust what you see on the LCD screen by adjusting the ISO. Now in post, everything's going to come in at either 800 or 12,800, depending on what ISO you were shooting at. Now, the idea behind it is that it's going to give you the best image quality because it's at the base ISO. So it's going to give you the least amount of noise when you're shooting. And then you'll adjust it in post to get you to the proper exposure. What I would recommend doing is trying to use ND filters to ultimately get to the proper exposure. So if it's a little too bright out or bright in your studio, throw an ND filter on there. If it's a little too dark, then bring your lights up to get yourself to the proper exposure. Now you can do the same thing with the standard ISO that's built into the S-Log3. For example, you'd be shooting at 640 versus 800, and you could do the same thing. So if you're in a studio setup, and you could properly light your scene based on those base ISOs. Now again, the downside with the Cine EI is that it does not allow any auto white balance. So it's not really meant for running and gunning. If you're looking to run and gun with this camera, you're gonna want to use Sony's S-Log3 standard picture profile. Now this thing has fans on it, so it's got an exhaust system for the fans here on the side and on the bottom of the camera. I've been using this thing for 2 weeks now. Granted, I do live in a relatively cooler climate, so I think the hottest it got up to was like 80 degrees, but normally in my area it's between 50 and 70 degrees during the month of September. And the fans did not kick on once with this. At least if they did, I didn't even notice them. So they're super quiet, so you're not gonna have to worry about these fans causing any noise problems. Now this thing is small, compact, so if you're looking to use this for vlogging, it definitely does a great job. It's got the flippy screen so you can see yourself. Now it also comes with an XMLR handle, which is a top handle, which is nice, but I don't have an XMLR microphone, so unfortunately I was not able to test that. This thing has no EVF, which to be honest with you, does make it a little difficult for me, because one of the things that I do like to do is sometimes I like to watch back my footage to ensure that I got the shot in focus. So what do? I normally put my eye up to the EVF because the EVF is usually better quality than the LCD screens. This thing is just over 1 million dots, so it's not the greatest LCD screen that you're gonna get, and sometimes trying to see if you nailed focus on this can be really difficult. But I do get that they got rid of the EVF for a lot of these screws on top, so you can mount a bunch of different things. This thing is pretty much like a built-in cage. You can add side handles on this thing, so this way you can try and get more stability. You could really rig this thing out. So let me jump in here real quick and say, if you're liking this video and you're liking this review, do me a favor, hit that like button and that subscribe button and also that bell notification so you don't miss out on my future videos. There's going to be more videos just like this coming up in the future. Now let's go ahead and get to the cons of the Sony FX3. So we already mentioned one of the cons, the fact that this thing has no EVF and this LCD screen is not the greatest. I really wish this camera had the LCD screen from the Sony AR4A or the AR3A. And why? Because then you would be able to see a lot better what shots are in focus. There's really no reason why Sony can't give you a better LCD screens. They make amazing cell phones with great screen quality. Maybe they'll come out with the FX3A like they did with the AR series and make this camera an even better value. Because if this thing had a better LCD screen, I could definitely recommend it as your one and done YouTube camera, vlogging, for studio setup, for everything. The other thing I'm not crazy about is how the on-off switch is over here. I'm used to having it up here on the shutter, but I completely understand because this shutter, instead of it having an on-off switch, it has a zoom in, zoom out rocker. So you're able to zoom in and out. And also if you have this thing set to clear image zoom and you're using a prime lens, it will do zooming in and out. You could take, let's say, your 20 millimeter, a great vlogging lens, and you could zoom in and you can get to like 30 millimeters using clear image zoom. You can also do digital zooms, but I don't recommend that with any sort of camera because then you're just cropping in on the sensor. The clear image zoom is supposed to give you the same exact quality video and get you up to 1.5 times zoom on 4K without losing any of that image quality. Now, when you're using the Cine EI, this camera will only let you do 1080p over HDMI. Don't know why it won't do 4K. Maybe it just doesn't have the capability, but it will only do 1080p. So if you're using an external monitor and you're trying to record with that Cine EI, it's not going to do 4K for you. It's only going to do 1080p. Now 1080p might be good enough depending on what you're doing, but I did find that to be a con when shooting with this camera. The other thing that I found with this camera that's a con is that the battery life really drained fast for me. I found that if I shot with this camera for maybe about 45 minutes to an hour, I was down to like 40% battery life. Now I was using Sony's native batteries for this, and I don't think that my batteries have been depleted really in any way. So I think it's more of the processing power and everything that's going into this camera. It definitely drains the battery pretty quickly. So you're gonna probably want 2 or 3 batteries on you if you're gonna be doing an all-day shoot. Now I did promise you a comparison of this camera to the Sony a7S3. Now here's the deal. The guts, they're pretty much the exact same. Where I think the Sony a7S3 shines for a more of a hybrid shooter is you get the EVF. Now the EVF is the best EVF that you can get for any Sony camera. Now it's over 9 million dots, so that thing is going to give you crystal clear, lifelike images. And I can tell you when I used it, I found that the EVF was beautiful and gorgeous, and it really helped me review my shots after the fact. Did I use it when I was shooting? No, I really did not. It was more for after, when I was checking my shot back to ensure that the quality was what I wanted it to be. The focus was where it needed to be. So for this camera, I really did miss the viewfinder on it. The advantage that this camera has that the Sony a7S3 doesn't have is it does have this version 2 firmware. Without a shadow of doubt, that version 2 firmware is really a fantastic upgrade for this camera. That main menu system is a welcome addition to this camera. It makes this camera so usable. It's very usable for the average user to be able to pick it up and change settings pretty quickly. The only thing that I wish they would have done with that version 2 is make it so that the ISOs and the aperture and all that other stuff you could change by just tapping on the screen. But a quick hit of the menu button and you're right into that menu and you're able to change everything right there. Now another advantage that this camera has over the Sony a7S III, it has all of the mounting holes, so you can easily mount things on this thing and rig it out any way you want. Now the Sony a7S III, you will need to get a cage for that if you want to mount a whole bunch of stuff on it. On this thing, this is a cinema line camera, and now with this latest firmware, it really earns that cinema label. My final conclusion, which one should you get? Well, first off, let's go ahead, switch over to this camera so I can give you some image quality while using the 16 and 35 GM lens. Let's go ahead and do that right now. So now we're back on the Sony FX3. So how does the image quality look? This should give you great 4K video. What's really nice, since they did the firmware 2.0 upgrade, everything is pushed off of the screen. So this way, none of your settings are interfering with your video on the screen. To sum this thing up, which way would I ultimately go if I had to pick between the FX3 and the Sony a7S III? I think I would still personally go with the Sony a7S III. I'm not doing enough cinema work to justify getting this camera. Now this camera does a great job of really making images look beautiful, but so does the Sony a7S III. I'll be honest with you, if you can get the a7S III a little bit cheaper, that thing is going to be a better hybrid camera for the average hybrid shooter. I do want to thank Sony for letting me borrow the FX3 for the last 2 weeks to help do this review for you. I really appreciate the partnership that we've forged so far, and hopefully it will continue in the future. If you have any comments or questions regarding the FX3, go ahead and leave those down in the description description below. But if you like this video, I'm sure you're gonna like the video on the screen now. It's about another Sony camera. Go ahead and click on that video now, and I'll see you on that video next. Before you leave, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Thanks for watching.